Today we're going to create a natural border to the east side of downtown Amaranth by detailing this creek that runs down the hillside and then fleshing out the surrounding neighborhood. As usual, we'll be taking inspiration from Duluth, this time looking at Chester Creek, which is in the same spot that we're working in, with a particular focus on this bridge that spans the ravine. I really like the way that this bridge connects up with a different road in the grid on the other side of the ravine, so I wanted to start off by building out the grid to the other side, following a stepwise pattern as the creek turns southwest. We'll tidy this up and add some more blocks in later on, but for now I just wanted to get a reference point for where the bridge and the creek are going to fit into all of this. Farther south, as we get to what will eventually be the more developed commercial area, the grid is simply going to cross over the creek and we'll add in some culverts under the road to allow more space for development. The road on the left here connects all the way up to the main streetcar avenue in the center of downtown, so I thought that this would be the best choice to carry over the bridge, kind of as a secondary sort of main road. These sorts of low traffic bridges, in my experience, usually seem to be quite a bit slimmer than the roads that lead into them, so I'm going to use this skinny blank road for the bridge span. Because this bridge structure is meant for a wider road, I'm going to squeeze it down to size using PO, and then fiddle around with the nodes on either side to make sure that the taper stops at the correct point. A little bit of IMT stuff is needed to blend the nodes in more seamlessly, so I'm going to lower the width of this grass network to mimic the grass strip from the main road asset, and of course I'm going to carry the double yellow line all the way across as well. The bridge in Duluth has these patches on them, which is maybe not so reassuring of the structural integrity of the bridge, but it does look pretty good, so I'm going to add those in with some decals. For the final touch, I'm going to shrink down these concrete pillars and clip them into the bridge's built-in fences to give it a bit more of a beefy look. And finally, a few of these nice old lamps are going to top those off, although I did have to adjust the number of posts here so that there was an odd number because I only wanted one lamp in the center of either side so as to not overlight the bridge. Leaving the bridge aside for the time being, it's time to pave over the watercourse so that it can serve as the city's newest arterial road. So that I can see the network as I place it down, because I'm then going to come back and upgrade it to an invisible road. And the reason that I'm using this invisible road is because I want to add my own water decals back in on top. This might not look too convincing as a stream at this point, but I mostly want this just to fill in the background so that if you happen to catch a glimpse of it through the massive amounts of trees that we're going to put down later, it looks like there's some water down there. And then there are a couple of areas that are going to be more exposed, which I'm going to spend a lot more time detailing to hopefully look realistic. Now that I have the stream down, I'm going to add a culvert on either side of these roads, just using a tiny version of the bridge structure from before, mostly because I didn't feel like closing out of the game and finding a purpose-made asset on the workshop. And these are sort of similar to the water decals, where they don't look fantastic on their own, but they're mostly going to be obscured by foliage and landscape, so I'm not too worried about that. I don't think it would make for a very good park if there wasn't public access of some kind, so I'm going to add in a small trail system. This runs in place of an alley through this block, which I think is kind of a cool little feature, and I thought it would be interesting to run it all the way across the stream using a slightly less imposing bridge than the one we used for the road. I actually end up using the vanilla bridge version of this path network, which I think actually looks really nice and fitting for this area. The main length of the trail is going to run alongside the stream, because that would basically be the main attraction of this park, would be to wander along the stream, although I am going to make some more or less arbitrary deviations to make it look a bit more winding, and I feel like that kind of makes the terrain feel higher resolution than what you can actually do in the game, so you can imagine all the little variations in slope and terrain type where they've chosen to jog the trail in one direction or another, or do switchbacks or something like that. This is similar to the stream decals and the culverts in approach, where most of it is just there to fill in the background, and the majority of it is going to be covered from view by trees. Did I mention that we're going to be putting down a few trees later? Oh, and we're also going to put down... I'm going to use these amazing animated waterfall props by Ryuichi Kaminogi, which somehow had not been on my radar until I went to do this build. The best thing about these props is that they stay animated when you convert them to POs, and maybe you can see how that's going to come in handy for a build like this, where I didn't really want a giant waterfall. I didn't think that would really fit into this environment too well, although it would certainly look cool. So anyway, after rotating the whole thing with PO, I'm going to use the distort function to form it to the environment and try to make it look like a very, very slight waterfall. I don't know if you'd even call it a waterfall, just like a slightly steeper length of creek. And I think that looks not too bad. It's going to look better once we surround it with some more rocks here. But basically, the only downside to this is that you do have kind of the cascade at the bottom of the waterfall where the water comes back up. So we're going to need to account for that with the detailing in a moment. But first, I wanted to add in this other stretch of slightly steeper creek that may or may not be a waterfall. And I'm going to use this smaller version and place 3 of them, just bending slightly back and forth so you can see a slight difference in the direction of the creek, and doing a similar thing with the distort function. What I think is really going to define the landscape surrounding the creek is these giant rock assets. I'm going to use them a couple of ways. First, fitting them to the watercourse so that you just get this little bit of rocky definition at the banks of the stream, which I think looks significantly better than just not having any detail along the banks. And second, as we progress northward toward the road bridge, I'm going to add in another layer at a higher elevation to form the walls of the ravine. The slope ends up looking a little bit precipitous as it is, but my plan is to add in foliage most of the way up to the edge of the cliff, and then at the bottom all the way up to the base. And that's going to obscure some of that change in elevation and just make everything look a bit more reasonable, less dramatic, and in line with the subtlety of the Midwestern landscape. Finally, to blend these rocks into the surrounding landscape a bit more smoothly, I'm going to fit these terraforming roads and drag them in as close as I can to the stream without disrupting the terrain in the center, which I think is going to maximize the surrounding area for development or tree placement or whatever we do there. And it's also going to trim off some of the extra bulk from the rock assets and make the ravine look a little bit smaller. Before covering up all the hard work that I've already put into this build with mass quantities of foliage, I wanted to take care of the functionality aspect of the park. So I'm going to use this invisible park entrance at this terminus of the trail, and then I'm going to connect that to the trail so that people can actually walk through it. I'm not sure what the extent of this park is eventually going to be, if it'll just go up to the bridge or all the way to the end of the trail that I've already laid down, or somewhere in between. But for now, I'm just going to assume the whole thing will be one continuous park, and I'm going to paint the park area accordingly. I don't have a name for this park, although I would like to keep it fairly simple, so something Creek Park. Do let me know if you have any suggestions for the name. Off camera, I finally did the task of going through my tree assets and putting together a new and improved forest brush. I tried to find a good balance of low poly and good looking trees that are closely matched in color temperature so that the forested areas of the city end up looking fairly cohesive, although there are a few lighter and darker trees to add some contrast. I also vastly reduced the number of coniferous trees in the brush and their chances to spawn so that they still pop up but don't dominate the skyline like in my old brush. I'm actually surprised at how different the silhouette of the hillside looks with this new type of forest, and I think it looks pretty nice and more realistic. So with our new assortment of arboreal assets all arranged, it's time to cover up most of this park with some foliage. As useful of a mod as the forest brush is, I thought that the most visible areas were just begging for a little bit of hand detailing to make sure that the area along the stream has a greater diversity of tree types and just generally looks more curated and hand placed, as is the way of Mother Nature. So that's going to involve these dead sticks, which I want to look like they've gotten stuck on the banks of the creek. Also a large variety of shrubs, because I wanted a range of textures for the undergrowth. Occasionally some grass decals to make the stream pop a little bit where it's more visible, and zooming out in scale just a little bit, I'm also going to hand place from a select variety of trees that I think will look good in this context. And what I was going for with that is that I want a much leafier, or maybe needlier for the coniferous trees, I don't know. But I just wanted a more lush and robust appearance to the forest next to the course of the stream so that you can track that course even if you can't see the water itself, if you know what I mean. That's not going to be so important down here where the stream is quite exposed and it's kind of more about these little fine details, but it's going to be very important higher up the ravine and the creek where the trees get much closer to the water course. After all that hand placement, I was getting pretty happy with how the build was looking, but there was one thing that I wanted to double down on, which was mixing in some more of these bare and dead trees into the most visible areas. So later on, after I had finished the rest of the build, which we'll get to in a minute, I downloaded this pack of dead pines, which I think look really nice, and came back and added some into the forest, which I think adds a nice textual element to the otherwise overwhelmingly green background. And also, I think it's just realistic to not have every single tree be alive and well. The final element for the park itself is going to be the main entrance, which isn't going to be too fancy by any stretch of the imagination, but still has some interesting details that I wanted to point out. First, I wanted to plop down a row of houses on either side so that we can have the trail running in between them. Second, we have a small paved pad that's going to contain the park's facilities, the most exciting of which is probably these wooden bollards, which maybe isn't a good sign for things to come. Other than that, it's just the lone map that I had in my collection that looked like it might fit in here, some trash cans, and a single bench. I also came back off camera and added in some toilets, so if that's something that really rustles your jimmies, then you might want to keep an eye out for those in the cinematics. I wanted to add a few parking spots right in front of the entrance, but since cars won't park in the middle of a node, I decided to experiment a little bit and see if I could get this invisible parking building to force some cars to park there. It ended up being 1/3 successful because 2 of the parking spots had cars clipping into the road pretty egregiously. So I just had to put down 2 cars and rotated them with PO to be in line with the slope of the road. Anyway, since this is a public path, I figured most people would want to fence off their backyards, so I'm going to alternate between a few different props for that, and then basically cover all of that up with trees. I was going for a similar effect to earlier, where I wanted the trees to be thicker along the pathway. With all that done, I think that the result looks pretty cool. Almost as cool as this guy's suit. So we're done with the park for now, but I don't think it's going to make its full impact on the city, visually speaking at least, until we fill in the surrounding area with development. So 25 episodes into a series about a city known for being built on the side of a hill, I finally realized that the Toggle It mod allows you to toggle contour lines on and off at will without having to open the terrain tool, which seems basically like a necessity for building in this kind of steep area. I mean, obviously it's not actually a necessity because I've made it this far, but it's much nicer to have. Anyway, in Duluth, this side of the creek is where you start to see hints of the grid breaking down, one instance of which is this winding road that runs along the northern side of the creek. I did want to build our version of this road, just a test run road building with the contour line feature, although we're not going to quite get to building anything along it today. Most of our attention for this development is going to be paid to the blocks immediately surrounding the park, starting with these 2 irregularly shaped blocks on this side of the creek. Now that we're farther away from the downtown, I tried to mix in a couple more newer looking developments in with the old historic homes. And I also tried to focus more on these kinds of smaller houses that have the gables facing the road, as that seems to be extremely common in Duluth. These couple of blocks didn't turn out the greatest. I think they probably needed a bit more variation, but either way, maybe you can see at least the direction that I was trying to move in. I will say that I enjoy making this kind of block a lot more than the kind of more filler blocks that we did a lot of in the last episode. Because I get to just focus a little bit more on the details and the variation, and just doing overall like a small number of these detailed blocks in important areas, and then doing the rest just kind of as really simple filler is going to be the way I'm going to go forward with this sort of area. So hopefully that'll strike a nice balance between scale and detail. Up here we have this half block that has its back up along the park, and I wanted to sneak in a lesser known entrance to the trail system here that is connected at the end of the alley. This is the sort of thing where the locals wouldn't really tell anyone about it because they want to keep it to themselves. One of those selfish neighbors is living in this really nice Tudor revival house that gets an entire half of a half block to itself. I also created a little dead end here by adding in a grass prop and a dirt decal, and then a couple of these skinny gabled houses to fill in the other side of the half block. Hopping on over to the other side of the ravine, probably not literally, we have a bit of a weird block. In Duluth, some of the blocks in this area don't have alleys running down the middle for whatever reason, which is fine by me. And since this is a fairly steep block, I'm going to go with that, and we're going to fill in the center with a bunch of trees after we put down an eclectic variety of houses. I'm going with the same sort of style here, where it's a really, really weird mix of the older single-family homes, 1 or 2 brick apartments, and a couple of more modern ones as well. The road that bounds the right side of this weird block is going to be a fairly important avenue because it runs all the way up from the frontage road along the freeway, where we're eventually going to build an interchange that accesses this entire side of the city. So along this road, I wanted to add a number of brick apartments. The one on the corner here, which is kind of the lone one in this block. And this is going to represent the far end of the taper of development along this main avenue. So as we go farther down the hill, you're going to start seeing more brick apartments and other kinds of density and stuff like that. And then eventually, when you get down near the freeway, we're going to enter a commercial area. That big commercial area will be coming in a future episode, though. I didn't want to stretch this episode too far. So today, I just wanted to finish fleshing out this area with some more filler houses and apartments, and then to complete the episode with some smaller, more detailed shops that are taking advantage of the nice area around the creek. This might sound a little bit sad, but I think that one of the most important things for a build of this type, where we have development on the outskirts of a downtown, are the parking lots. And not the giant kinds that you get with like a Walmart or whatever, but these smaller ones for apartment buildings or businesses or things like that. They're a little bit tricky to build in this context for a couple reasons. First, because we're working on a slope, you either need to slope the parking lot itself, which really limits the kinds of assets you can use because most pre-built parking lot assets don't really work too well with sloped terrain, or you need to build a bunch of retaining walls, which can get repetitive and pretty time consuming. I suppose you could actually do both if you happen to be feeling a little bit frisky, but usually it's one or the other. Second, they take up a lot of space, visually speaking, especially from the aerial view, so I feel like it's important to vary the types and the colors of surfaces used. Otherwise, everything just blends into the same shade of gray. Although I'm not sure which out of the 50 it would be, but they would all be the same. I think that same kind of logic applies to the painted spots themselves as well, although that's usually just a binary choice between white and yellow, so I just tried to vary it more or less at random. So as we go forward with detailing these commercial lots, I'm going to try to use a variety of assets to account for all those factors. As for the buildings themselves, I didn't want anything that stands out too much for the most part, so I'm just picking ones that look like basically the kind of car-centric shops that feel like they could have been built anytime from the 1950s to today. A lot of my commercial assets are wall-to-wall because most of the focus so far has been on the density of downtown, so I was fairly limited in the assets that I had in my collection at the time. Although these sorts of wall-to-wall buildings did come in handy from time to time, because you do find these sorts of more historic, traditional wall-to-wall buildings mixed into this context. I'm always on the lookout for new building assets of that sort of generic, car-centric, commercial type. So if you happen to know any good ones that you think would fit in the city, feel free to mention them down in the comments if you want. Or keep it to yourself. That's fine. I feel like a lot of the development we've done so far in this area has been a bit more on the repetitive side, so I wanted to finish up with a couple of builds that have a bit more character to them. There's this cool pair of shops in Duluth that has a parking deck sticking out over the creek. Maybe it's overkill, maybe not, but either way, I wanted to build it. So the slope is pretty intense here, so I'm going to use a second copy of each building so that we can have some rear entrances at the level of the alley, and that also serves to cover up the concrete foundation of the buildings as well, which is pretty ugly, so that's a good thing to do generally, in my opinion. Since this one didn't quite line up perfectly on the right here, I'm also going to add some stairs up to the back entrance, and also a more public set of stairs over here leading up to a path that runs alongside the building and connects to the sidewalk. The parking deck itself wasn't too complicated to make. I decided to skip trying to make it functional since I didn't have raisable functional parking spots in my collection. I think there might actually be some of those on the workshop, so maybe I should download those. But anyway, it's basically just some ploppable asphalt with the end piece angled with PO, surrounded by a network fence, and then a few decals to cover up the grass and make it look like there's a paved entrance. And then I'm going to manually plop some car props in since it's not functional. Because the positioning of the deck here was a little different than the one in Duluth, I didn't add any support structure underneath because it wouldn't really be visible. I guess I could have messed around with the terrain maybe to make some space for it, but I feel like that would just be asking for trouble given how finicky terrain can be when you've already placed down a bunch of stuff in a given area. So that's not going to happen. Another thing that caught my eye in Duluth was this barn thing, which appears to be used for a farmer's market, so that's kind of cool. I think the longer silhouette of the building and the red color really make it pop looking at it from above, and that's a nice compliment that really draws your eye over to the area surrounding the creek, or at least my eye. I don't know about yours. I'm going to use these gravel roads to build up the empty lot around it, which is maybe a bit more complicated than it might seem at first because of the slope. Even though it's a fairly slight slope, it still needs a little bit of adjustment to get that right. Next door, there's a tiny little diner, which was pretty much the only asset I had that was skinny enough to fit on this absurd slope. And the area cleans up pretty nicely, I think, once I plaster it with shrubs and trees. Also, this building is called the Cooperstown Diner, which I thought sounded kind of familiar, and when I checked the workshop page, which I will link down in the description, this asset is by Room Mike, I found out that it's based on a real building in the small town of Cooperstown, New York, where I happen to have visited. Although I don't think I went to the diner itself, I think I would probably remember a building this adorable. Next episode, we're going to do a build that's somewhat similar to this, except more focused on some of the stuff that's near downtown with a bit more density and some more historic buildings. Although there probably won't be a detailed creek, most likely. And with that, the video is complete. Thank you to my channel members, with a special shout out to my $5 tier members, New and Victor Sellen. And thank you for watching.